Hey there. Tonight we're not diving into castles or shining armor. There's no royalty here, no glorious battles or grand feasts. Instead, we're heading to the edge of the known world, at least as far as our medieval peasant is concerned. This isn't the history that ends up in oil paintings. This is the history that hums low, like the sound of a fire crackling in the dark. Quiet, steady, real. Now, if you're someone who finds peace in this kind of slow, grounded storytelling, go ahead and like the video. Maybe even subscribe if it brings you calm. And hey, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. There's something really soothing about knowing we're all lying in the quiet together, even if we're miles apart. So go ahead, dim the lights. Turn on that background fan if you love that low white noise. And let's start where the roads end, where the forest begins, and the maps go blank. This place doesn't really have a name. Or if it did, once no one says it anymore. It's a shallow valley tucked into the folds of the land like a forgotten coin. There's no real path to it, just a muddy groove carved by the same ox carts that have rumbled through for generations. It's far enough from anything important that even the tax collector sometimes forgets it exists. You wouldn't find it on a map if you had a map. But you don't. You've never even seen one. All you know is that the forest begins just beyond your home, thick and unmoving, like something old and half asleep. It doesn't feel like it wants you there. The fields stretch out in uneven patches, green here, brown there, worked until your body gives out, and then worked some more. Somewhere, up north, there's a river. You've never seen it, but you've heard about it in the same kind of voice people use when they talk about saints or dragons. It might as well be the ocean for how real it feels. This is where you were born. This is where you'll die. Maybe 60 steps from your front door to the edge of the field and back. Your whole life measured in footsteps and weather. The houses in your village aren't much to look at. They lean like they're tired of standing. The walls are made from wattle and daub, basically a mess of mud straw and sticks woven together and patched again and again until the walls forget where they end and the repairs begin. The thatched roofs droop under years of rain and wind. They leak in places you can't reach and creak in the wind like they're trying to say something. The village smells like wet wool, wood smoke, and animals. A sour twist of manure and something vaguely rotten. You don't even notice it anymore. It's just the scent of your life. The scent of survival. Time here isn't measured by clocks. You don't own a clock. The nearest church bell is from a neighboring village and only reaches your ears when the wind's just right. Mostly, you track the day by where the sun sits in the sky or by how deep the shadows stretch over your doorstep. When your back starts aching before the stew's warm, it's about noon. That's close enough. There's maybe a dozen families here. Everyone knows everyone, and more importantly, everyone knows everyone's business. But no one talks about it unless they have to. That's just the unspoken rule. The closest thing to a leader you've got is old Tom. He once had a conversation with a traveling monk, and now he's the closest thing to wisdom in the whole valley. No one really questions him. His hut hasn't collapsed. His goat looks well fed. That's about all you need to qualify as a village elder. Nothing is official here. There are no deeds, no documents. Land ownership is marked by vague references like past the old tree stump or where the ground gets soft. If two families argue over it, someone brings bread and they talk until nobody wants to fight anymore. That's your version of law. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. If a stranger shows up, it becomes the most exciting thing to happen in months. Everyone whispers, "Where are they from? Why are they here? Are they cursed? Do they smell like the sea?" And just as quickly, they vanish and things go back to quiet. And people don't leave. Not really. The idea of travel is more fantasy than possibility. You've heard stories of cities of buildings 2 or even 3 stories high, of shops full of cloth and spices and light that doesn't come from fire. But those are tales, stories to tell when the stew boils and you need something to talk about. Even if you wanted to go, you wouldn't know how. There are no signs, no clear roads, just tracks and rumors. And the forest, always the forest. The trees don't like visitors. The roots are like traps. The shadows feel heavier the further you walk. Wolves live out there maybe, or worse people who've decided the village isn't for them anymore and who've grown strange in the silence. But even beyond the forest, what then? You don't speak the city tongue. You don't carry coin. You don't know the customs. You wouldn't know how to ask for food without sounding like a fool. You don't even know how old you are, just how many winters you've survived. So you stay. Not out of fear, really. More out of habit, out of knowing. You know this place. You know where to find dry firewood, even after a storm. You know who has the best kindling. You know how to patch the roof, where to hide your better tools, how to fix a fence, and half the time it takes someone to explain it. You know this life. The way it starts when the light comes and ends when the dark returns. You know the rhythm of it. Work, eat, rest, repeat. It's not much, but it's yours. And in that quiet, slow rhythm, there's something almost like peace. Not the kind of peace you read about in books, but the kind you feel in your bones. The kind you don't have to explain. Just live. Tomorrow the sun will rise again over the same hills. The stew will still need stirring. The chickens will still need chasing. And the roof, well, there's always the roof, but you'll be there. Because you always are. You'll walk 100 miles in your life, but almost every one of them will be in a circle. That's not poetic. That's just how it is. For a medieval peasant, the world didn't stretch far. Not because there was no desire to see beyond the hills, but because the risks far outweighed the dreams. You learned early that everything beyond the edge of the village might as well be another world entirely. The next village over may be 5 miles, maybe 10. But you haven't been there. You've heard the names. You've heard the gossip. Who married who stole what, whose priest fell asleep during Mass. But all secondhand. You've never seen their fields. You've never walked their paths, and honestly, you're not even sure how to get there. It's not that you don't have legs or curiosity. You have both. But travel wasn't the adventure it sounds like in stories. It was slow, dangerous, and most of all, lonely. If you left and got lost, no one was coming to find you. There are no rescue parties, no maps, no signs, just dirt tracks through dense forests and wide open spaces with no shelter and no guarantee of arrival. You were taught to follow vague directions. Go until the leaning pine tree, then turn left where the stone looks like a pig sleeping. Helpful until you realize that in the wrong light, every tree leans and every stone looks like something. And then there's the forest. Medieval forests weren't gentle, inviting things. They weren't places for picnics or leisurely walks. They were tangled and dark, full of roots that grabbed your ankles and sounds that never quite explained themselves. Boars, wolves, bandits, spirits maybe, or just desperate people who didn't want to be found. The woods were deep. If they wanted to, they could swallow you whole. Bandits were the other threat. Not the swashbuckling kind from tales. Just hungry men. Angry men. men with nothing to lose. A traveler, walking alone, was a promise of coin of food of something worth taking, especially if that traveler looked healthy, especially if that traveler was a woman. Confidence wasn't protection. Being bold didn't make you safe. It just made you noticeable. And even if you avoided the forest and the bandits, you could still get lost. Not, oops, let me check my phone, lost, real lost. You could walk for days without seeing another person. You could take a wrong turn and find yourself deeper into nowhere than you thought possible. And if the sun dipped before you found shelter, well, that was a problem. A big one. You didn't carry supplies. You didn't carry much of anything. Your body could vanish into the underbrush like smoke, and no one would know. No one would come looking. By the time someone thought to ask where you were, they'd already assume you were gone, and maybe you were. But let's say you did reach another village. Let's say you made it through the mud and trees and silence. What then? You weren't expected. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders were trouble. Outsiders brought disease or bad luck or new ideas that no one wanted to hear. You spoke a slightly different dialect. Maybe you had a weird accent. Maybe you held your spoon funny. That was enough to make people stare. You'd be met with suspicion, with silence, with closed doors. Hospitality wasn't guaranteed. Food was already scarce. Beds were already shared by too many. You weren't family. You weren't known. And in a world where knowing someone meant trusting them with your very survival being unknown was dangerous. So people didn't travel. Or if they did, it was out of desperation. The sick who heard of a miracle healer 3 towns away. The young men chased rumors of work. The occasional fool dreaming of glory. Most of them didn't come back. And when they didn't, no one said much. Just a quiet, he went beyond the trees, as if that explained everything. Because in a way it did. For those who stayed, life was small. But it was known. You weren't alone. You had neighbors, family. You shared your day with the animals you fed and the ground you tilled. There was comfort in repetition. You knew the sound your roof made when it was about to leak. You knew the exact shade the sky turned before a storm. You knew the way your mother's voice rose when the stew needed more salt. You didn't need to leave to understand the world. You understood this world. And this world, limited as it was, gave you enough. You didn't need to eat cinnamon to understand sweetness. You didn't need to visit a city to know community. You didn't need a war to understand fear or love or loss. You had all of that here. Children grew taller. Animals aged. Fence posts rotted. People passed on their knowledge one muddy footprint at a time. And slowly, the idea of travel faded. Not with sadness, but with acceptance. Some people were meant to move. You were meant to stay. There were no blueprints for the life you built. No designs. Just a pile of wood, some rough tools, and a deep understanding of how the land worked and how it didn't. Your home wasn't a castle. It wasn't even what most people would call a house. It was a truce between weather and effort, between decay and determination, between what you needed and what the earth would give you. You started with the frame rough wood from trees that weren't quite straight, but were close enough. You didn't need perfection. You needed shelter. You needed something that wouldn't collapse before winter. Then came the wattle-thin branches, bent and woven into the frame like basket work. And then the daub, a sloppy, sticky mix of mud and straw slapped on by hand and pressed between the gaps until it held. It wasn't elegant. It didn't smell good. But it worked. Mostly. The roof was thatch. Straw laid down in overlapping bundles tied tight to the beams. When new it looked golden, almost proud, but time and birds and rain wore it down. Eventually, it sagged, leaked, and frayed until you knew exactly where to put the buckets. You patched it constantly, and it never really stayed fixed. The floor dirt, you told yourself it was packed hard. Sometimes it was, until the rains came and it turned to mud again, then froze, then cracked, then softened again. You might throw straw over it, rushes, anything to make it feel less like the ground. But by the end of the month, it was all just dust and crumbs and goat prints again. You slept cooked and lived in the same room. Maybe two if you were lucky, but probably one. No privacy, no quiet. Just people, animals, tools, and memories stacked together like firewood. But it was home. When you walked through the door, crooked as it was, and smelled the smoke, and saw the same dent in the wall that had been there since your grandfather leaned on it wrong, you felt a strange kind of peace. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even comfortable, but it was yours. And when the wind howled, and the snow pushed against the walls, and the darkness settled in like a second roof, you knew you'd built something that could hold, something that like you might just last through another winter. Inside your home, the world feels like a patchwork of warmth, noise, and smoke. There's no real layout, not like houses today. Just space. Shared space. All of it. You eat here, you sleep here, you mend your tools here. You argue, you laugh, you stay quiet. You do everything in the same room because you don't have another option, and you've never needed one. If there's another room, it's more like a lean-to or a loft added after the fact. Maybe your father built it. Maybe it just sort of leaned into place over time. But mostly, it's just this one big space where everything happens surrounded by walls that shift with the seasons, and a roof that complains when it rains. In the center, if you're lucky, there's a hearth, not a fireplace, not something carved and ornate, just a place where fire happens. Stones or bricks, or maybe even just a packed ring of clay. A hole in the roof above it that kind of lets the smoke out. Sometimes it works. Mostly, it doesn't. Smoke fills the room like a second ceiling. It clings to your clothes, your hair, the very air itself. You get used to blinking through it. You don't really notice until someone new comes in and starts coughing. And the smell. It's always there. Smoke and wet wool, damp wood. Stew that's been reheated too many times. It's not a bad smell exactly, just lived in, like the house itself is breathing along with you. Furniture is minimal. A bench, a table if someone had the tools, maybe a stool with a wobbly leg. Storage is whatever you can hang from the rafters. A sack of onions, garlic braids, dried herbs. If you're lucky, a ham hanging in the smoke to cure, though it's probably been there for months, and everyone's pretending not to notice the mold on the edges. Beds aren't really beds. They're wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers if you've got them. Usually shared. You might be sleeping beside your spouse, your child, your cousin, maybe even someone else's child if their parents are sick. Blankets are thick and rough, always slightly damp, never quite warm enough. You don't sleep alone, not ever. It's not about affection, it's about warmth. Even the animals join you: chickens in a basket, the goat curled near the wall, the cow off in the corner. Yes, the cow, because she gives milk, and you need her alive through the winter. And if that means she gets the warmest spot in the room, then so be it. The floor is dirt. It shifts beneath your feet. You sweep it, sort of, or you scatter fresh straw on it and pretend that's cleaning. But after a while, the straw gets walked flat and mixed with whatever the chickens leave behind and becomes part of the floor again. It's all just part of the house. The windows. Just holes in the wall with wooden shutters if you're lucky. No glass. Never glass. Too expensive. Too rare. So the wind comes in. The cold comes in. The smell of sheep and smoke. and the distant sound of someone chopping wood. It all comes in. And the door. One door. Always slightly crooked because the frame shifted after the last frost. You latch it with a wooden peg or a bent bit of iron. Not to keep out intruders, there's nothing to steal, but to keep the wind out and the chickens in. When a stranger passes through your village, and that doesn't happen often, they see poverty. They see dirt and smoke and sagging walls. But you see effort. You see stories. You see a roof that hasn't fallen a hearth, that still burns a wall, that held its shape through 5 winters, and a storm that nearly ripped the thatch off the entire house. This isn't failure. This is survival. And when you lie down at night, body aching nose cold smoke still swirling above you, and the soft shuffle of the goat in the corner, there's a comfort in all of it. Not luxury, not pride, but presence. This is your space. It leaks. It creaks. It smells like old stew and burnt straw. But it's held. And so have you. Now let's talk about food. Not feasts. Not roast boar and candied fruit. That's the stuff of kings and songs. Your meals are simpler. Much, much simpler. For the average peasant, food is a daily challenge, not a joy, not a celebration. Just a problem to solve one more time using whatever you've got, which most days isn't much. The centerpiece of almost every meal pottage. It's a kind of stew, or maybe soup, or maybe just a pot where food goes to wait. You never really start a batch from scratch. It just sort of continues. A perpetual stew. It's always on, always bubbling. You throw in what you have, you ladle some out, you throw more in. Some of it has been cooking for days. Some of it might be weeks old. It's warm. It fills your belly. That's what matters. What's in it? Cabbage, leeks barley, maybe some beans if you've got them. Garlic or onions if the harvest was good. In winter, dried peas. And if you're really lucky, a bit of pork, usually just the bone. Meat is rare. Bones are precious. The pot is never really clean. It's scraped, maybe wiped, but scrubbed. Not often. There's a flavor that builds up over time. Not seasoning, just history. Boiled gray and earthy. And you eat it with bread. Not the fluffy golden kind, not even close. Your bread is dense hard, often dark with rye or barley. If it's wheat, you're doing very well. But that's rare. Usually it's whatever grain the manor left you ground into flour that's more husk than anything else. Sometimes it's mixed with peas or acorns, or even the ground-up inner bark of trees. Yes, actual bark. That's not a joke. That's famine bread. When times are bad, and they're often bad, you use what you have. Bread isn't always fresh. It's not meant to be. You might eat it stale, or use it as a plate, a trencher. Soak your stew in it. Then eat the soggy remains, or pass it to someone lower down the table. Bread, even when hard as rock, still has a role. Protein. That's rare. Chickens lay eggs. Cows give milk. You don't kill them unless you're desperate. When you do, you use everything. Meat, fat, organs, blood, bones. Nothing is wasted. The fat is rendered. The head becomes soup. The blood might become pudding. Fish is possible, but dangerous. Lords own the rivers. Fishing without permission can earn you a fine or worse. If you do catch something, it's likely eels or small muddy river fish. You salt what you can, if you can. The church, of course, has opinions on food. You can't eat meat on Fridays, or during Lent, or on saint days, which means you eat fish, or you don't eat, or you get creative. There's a reason beaver tails were considered fish by some monks. It wasn't theology. It was hunger. Milk spoils fast, so you turn it into cheese or butter, if you can. Butter's a luxury. Cheese is dry, hard, tangy. A good round of cheese is something to be proud of, something to save for winter, even if it molds you cut around it and carry on. And drinks. Water isn't always safe, so you drink ale, weak ale, called small beer, brewed at home, drunk by everyone, even kids, just enough alcohol to make it safer than water. You drink it with breakfast, with dinner, to help you sleep. Not to get drunk, just to stay alive. If you have apples, maybe cider. Wine is for priests. Mead is a myth. Milk is for babies. Ale is for survival. Vegetables make up most of your diet. Cabbage, onions, turnips, leeks, carrots, though they're white or purple. Not orange. That comes later. You eat root to leaf. Nothing wasted. Skins tossed in the fire. Tops boiled down. Even compost is rare. You burn what you don't eat. Fruits, seasonal. Apples, berries, wild plums. You eat them fast or dry them if you can. Sugar is a fantasy. Honey is rare and precious. If someone has bees, you protect them like treasure. And herbs, you grow them when you can. Mint, dill, sage. Not for flavor, for medicine or tradition. Some for pest control, some to ward off illness. Sometimes they help, sometimes they don't. But you use them anyway. Meals are eaten around the fire, on benches, on laps. No courses, no recipes. Just the pot, the bread, and the hope that there's still something left tomorrow. You don't complain. Complaining doesn't thicken the stew. So now you've got your house, your hearth, your stew. That's more tradition than taste. But here's the truth. The land you live on, it's not really yours. Not the house, not the field, not even the pig you've been raising since spring. All of it belongs to someone else, someone higher. You're what they call a villain. Not a villain, but close enough. It means you work the land, but don't own it. You're bound to it. You can't just pack up and leave. You can't sell your patch of land or pass it on freely to your kids. You owe labor goods, loyalty. And maybe more than anything else, you owe silence. Your Lord isn't a king. You probably don't even know what the king looks like. He's just a name you mention during prayers, right after the saints and right before the sheep. No, your Lord is the landowner who lives up on the hill in a house that doesn't leak and eats food that doesn't boil for 3 days straight. You might see him from time to time, usually on horseback, usually not looking down. You don't deal with him directly. That would be absurd. You deal with the steward, or the reeve, or the bailiff. Men with ledgers, with small eyes and sharp questions. They walk your village with wax tablets or parchment, asking how much barley you harvested, how many eggs your hens laid, whether your son is old enough to swing a scythe yet. You answer carefully, not too much detail. The steward doesn't like detail. He likes numbers. You owe a lot. Start with labor. A few days each week, you work your Lord's land instead of your own. Harvest time. That can stretch to every day. This is called corvée. You don't get paid. You don't get thanked. You just know that while your own patch of rye is wilting, you're out in someone else's field, making sure their grain is bundled and dry before the rain comes. You owe crops. A portion of your barley, a fraction of your beans, chickens, eggs, wool. If you've got it, they'll take it. Even your ale if you brew. Even your pig if it gets fat enough. And the taxes don't end with food. If you use the mill to grind your grain, and you have to Because hand grinding is often banned, you pay a fee. The mill is owned by the Lord. So is the oven. If you want to bake your bread there, that's another fee. If you try to build your own oven at home and get caught, there's a fine. Maybe worse. Same with the wine press. Same with the pasture. Same with the fish in the river, even if you catch it with your bare hands. There's a rule for everything. And a cost. Want to get married? Pay a fee. Want to pass your land to your son? Pay a fee. Want to move to another village? You guessed it. Pay a fee and ask permission. And no, they don't always say yes. Your tools might be taxed. Your livestock might be taxed. Your right to have children, well, technically, not taxed. But nothing is ever really free. And what do you get in return? Well, in theory, protection. If bandits come, the Lord has men who can fight. If there's a war, he might build a wall. If there's famine, he might release some grain maybe. If your neighbor's goat eats your turnips, the manor court might hear your case. But don't expect justice. Expect something. It's all part of feudalism. A great big web of obligation where everyone is under someone else. And the person under always gives more than they get. It's not just a system. It's the only way the world works. Or so you're told. And you go along with it not because you're fooled, but because the alternatives are worse. If you don't pay, there are punishments, fines, extra labor. In the worst cases, your tools can be taken, your home reclaimed, your animals seized. And what are you going to do about it? Who are you going to complain to? The same steward who just took your last chicken. So you pay. You bow when the Lord rides by. You speak the right words. Not because you believe he's better, but because you don't want to cause trouble. And maybe, just maybe, you hope that someday he might take notice. Give you a bit of land, a kind word, a break from labor. It almost never happens. But hope is hard to kill, because that's what the system runs on. Not just fear, but hope. The faint idea that if you work hard enough, obey long enough, pray loud enough, something might change. You tell yourself that when you lift the hoe, when you watch your best grain disappear into someone else's cart, when your child goes to bed hungry and you scrape the last of the stew from the pot, you keep going. The system isn't fair, but it is stable, predictable. You know what you owe. You know what's expected. You know that every spring the steward will show up with his little book and you'll stand in the same spot and you'll answer the same questions and you'll give and give and give. And once in a while they give something back. A feast day where there's extra bread. A holiday where the labor is waived. A tiny mercy dressed up as generosity. Just enough to keep things from breaking. The Lord lives apart. Sometimes, literally, on higher ground. His home is stone, not mud. His roof doesn't sag. Inside are rugs servants' wine. You've never been inside. You probably never will be. But you know it's there. You've seen the smoke rise from the chimney. You've seen the lights at night too high and too bright for any fire you could afford. He wears wool lined with fur, eats food you've only heard described. He might not know your name, but he knows your numbers. How many sacks of barley you owe. How many eggs your household produced last year. Whether your eldest daughter is old enough to marry if he decides she's worth marrying. The steward records everything, not you. You can't read, but he can. Or at least he can copy letters. He writes down what you owe, what you paid, what you failed to deliver. And if you fall behind, there's a list of punishments waiting. Resistance, not really a thing. You don't revolt. You don't rise up. You're not a soldier. You're not a fool. You have a roof to patch and a goat that's about to give birth. You have things to do. You don't have time to be a hero, but even still, you find ways to survive within the system. You trade quietly. You hide a little flour. You tell the steward the pig died even though it didn't. You save an extra egg for a neighbor in exchange for help fixing your fence. You build your own justice, your own safety net, your own tiny rebellion by making sure you and your people don't get crushed beneath the weight of someone else's comfort. You weren't free, but you weren't powerless either. You endured, and that in this world was everything. Even before the plague, even before history wrote it down and gave it a name, sickness lived with you. It was always there, hiding in the water, clinging to the straw, following your footsteps like a shadow that never stepped back. You didn't think of it as something that hit or struck. It didn't arrive. It was just part of the background, like rain, like cold. It started small, a cough, a rash, a sore that didn't close the way it should, a bit of blood in the handkerchief you didn't mean to cough into. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. There were no hospitals. Not really. If your village was lucky, there was a woman who knew which herbs helped with swelling, which bark eased pain, which mushrooms to avoid. A midwife, a healer. Maybe someone who burned herbs more than she boiled them. People trusted her, but they whispered too. That line between healing and witchcraft was thin, especially when things got bad. If you were really lucky, maybe there was a monk nearby. Someone literate. Someone with access to old books and old prayers. Someone who meant well, but probably didn't know much more than you did. But most times when you got sick, you stayed home. You stayed in bed, and you waited. You hoped. People didn't understand what caused disease. The word germ didn't exist. Microscopes were fantasy. You had theories, though. Oh, you had plenty of those. Bad air miasma was a popular one. If a place smelled foul, it was probably dangerous, which ironically was sometimes true. So, you stuffed herbs into your clothes. You carried flowers. You burned wood with strange barks in it and waved the smoke around like it could push the sickness out. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. Or maybe the sickness came from sin, from your thoughts, from something you did or said or failed to say when the priest looked you in the eye. People blamed themselves, or their neighbors, or their goats, anything really. And when people got desperate, the explanations got stranger. The moon, the evil eye, a glare from someone with jealousy in their heart, spirits, demons, the ghost of someone who hadn't been buried right. One of the more popular beliefs was that sickness entered through your feet, so people boiled them. And if that didn't work, they'd burn something else. Maybe their mattress, maybe their linens, just to feel like they were doing something. Cures were no less bizarre. If you had a fever, you might be bled. A man with a knife and a bowl would come around and cut your arm open. Not because he hated you, but because he believed he was saving you. He might use leeches. He might use a sharp rock. But the goal was to let the bad out. The body people believed was ruled by four humors: blood phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. If those were out of balance, you were out of balance. You didn't need to see these humors. No one had. But they were the reason for everything from headaches to heartbreak. If your legs swelled, someone might tie a mashed onion to it. If your eyes blurred, you might breathe in smoke while someone whispered a prayer. If your stomach cramped, you might drink vinegar or charcoal or warm beer mixed with crushed snails. You didn't have to believe these things worked. You just had to want them to. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. And sometimes they made things worse. But they were better than doing nothing. Doing nothing was what you did when you were waiting to die. There were amulets, bits of bone metal cloth tied around your neck, sometimes blessed, sometimes buried at the edge of your home, sometimes worn until they disintegrated. You hung garlic by the door. You tied a red string around your child's wrist. You carved symbols into the wood above your bed. Hope didn't need evidence. It just needed habit. And when the sickness took someone anyway, you didn't cry loudly. You didn't scream. You just went quiet. You laid them out. You prayed. You lit a candle if you had one. And then you kept going. Because the cows still needed milking. Because the stew still needed stirring. Because you couldn't afford grief, not all at once. The worst was when it wasn't just one person. When something crept through the village and touched everyone. A cough, a rash, skin turning black, eyes going dull. You started noticing the silence first. No kids laughing. No goats calling. Just the wind and the sound of people trying not to make any. You heard rumors. From the merchant's cousin. From a traveler who passed through weeks ago. A sickness spreading. A fever that kills in 2 days. A black spot that means it's too late. Then it came. The Black Death. The Great Pestilence. You didn't need a name. You just saw the signs. People dying faster than you could bury them. Families locked in homes with no one coming out. No more bells ringing because no one had the strength to pull the rope. Bodies piled up, buried in haste. No last rites, no markers. Just dirt and silence. The priest did what he could, until he got sick too. Some people turned to God harder than ever. They walked through villages, whipping their own backs, begging for forgiveness. Others ran. They left everything and hoped they were faster than death. They usually weren't. And even as people died, the world didn't stop. The barley still needed cutting. The roof still needed mending. The stew still needed to be fed. Somehow you lived. Maybe your family didn't. Maybe your neighbor didn't. But you did. And that survival felt like its own punishment, or its own reward, or maybe both. The world was smaller after the sickness. The village quieter. But you kept going. You cleaned more. You boiled more. You learned what herbs to use and which ones to avoid. You whispered new prayers. You listened to new stories. You didn't call yourself lucky. You just endured. That was how you lived in a world where sickness was always watching. You didn't fight it. You didn't deny it. You just carried it with you like another shadow. Because that was life. Always one step away from gone, but not gone yet. When the light fades and the sun finally slips behind the trees, your world shrinks. There are no lanterns, no soft glows from windows, no city lights humming in the distance. Just darkness. Thick, heavy, real. Night in the medieval countryside isn't peaceful. It's not quiet in the way people like to imagine. It's quiet in the way a cave is quiet, where every sound feels louder because it's bouncing off the silence. The snap of a twig, the shuffle of hooves, a cough in the next bed, a breeze that sounds too much like whispering. The fire dims. You bank the coals, not because you want to, but because fuel is precious. You can't afford to keep it roaring all night. So you let it settle into a soft orange glow and pray it's enough to keep the cold from biting your toes. There's no candlelight spilling into the corners. Wax is too valuable. A candle might last you a week if you're careful. You save it for births, deaths, or the occasional emergency. Otherwise, Your night is lit by memory and instinct. You go to bed early, not because you're tired, though you are, but because there's nothing left to do. The sun goes down, and so do you. But sleep doesn't come all at once, at least not the way you might think. You sleep in two parts. First sleep, then waking, then second sleep. It's normal, expected. A rhythm built into your bones from the first time you curled up next to the fire as a child. The first sleep comes shortly after darkness falls. Everyone settles in. The house goes still. There's a shuffle of limbs, the creak of the straw mattress, the occasional grunt or whisper, and then slowly quiet. You sleep surrounded by others. Always. There's no such thing as privacy, not for peasants. Your parents, your children, a cousin or two, the neighbor's child, if their family's struggling. All of you together. And sometimes even the animals. The cow in the corner, the dog by the door, chickens under the bench. Not because you like it, but because that's how you keep warm. You don't undress. You don't have pajamas. You sleep in your clothes. Sometimes even in your boots if it's cold enough. You pile on cloaks, old wool blankets, anything that traps warmth. You sleep close. You endure the elbows, the fidgeting, the sounds. You get used to it. Then after a few hours, you wake. Not completely, just enough. It's not weird. It's not even a problem. It's tradition. Some people pray. Some stir the fire back to life. Some talk quietly, murmur stories, share dreams. Some use this time for other things, intimate things, because the rest of the night is too cold or too quiet or too full of snoring children. The in-between hours are strange, gentle, sometimes eerie. The fire flickers low. Shadows twist in the corners. The wind talks in the thatch. Some believe this time is when dreams slip into waking, when the world feels thinner. Like the veil between the living and the dead softens just enough to let something through. If you dream during this time, you remember it. You carry it into morning like a story you're supposed to tell, a message you're supposed to decode. Then comes the second sleep, deeper, slower. This is the sleep that heals you. That takes the ache out of your bones, or at least dulls it until morning. If you're lucky, it's uninterrupted. If you're not, you lie there and wait for the rooster, for the firelight, for someone else to shift and remind you you're still here. The night isn't silent. The house makes its own music, the soft rustle of straw, the breath of sleeping children, the crackle of coals, the groan of a roof beam adjusting to cold. Sometimes a snore, sometimes a prayer muttered by someone too old to sleep soundly. Sometimes the distant sound of coughing, the kind that sounds wet, deep, final. You don't comment. You just listen. You make a note. You say nothing. Outside, the world waits, and sometimes it doesn't wait kindly. The dark brings fear, and not just stories. Wolves howl in some places, real ones, hungry ones, the kind that get bolder when the snow comes deep and food grows scarce. You hear them. You pray your fence holds. You hope your animals stay quiet. Then there are people, thieves, drifters, desperate men with cold hands and colder hearts. People who don't knock, who move through the dark because they know others are afraid to. They look for the homes with no dogs, with no light, with doors that rattle on their hinges. And then there are the other fears, the ones that live in the corners of your mind, spirits, demons, witches, curses, ghosts of children never baptized, of neighbors who died with angry hearts. You don't speak their names, but you feel them in the draft, in the way your candle goes out too fast, in the way the fire refuses to catch no matter how you coax it. You protect yourself the best you can. Iron above the door, salt along the sill, a sprig of rue or rosemary tied with thread, and hung beside the hearth. A cross carved into the wood above the window. A blessing whispered over the bed. Sometimes string is tied around a child's wrist, just in case. You don't call it superstition, you call it tradition. Protection, hope. You don't sleep with your feet pointing toward the door. That's for corpses. You cover mirrors if you have any. You don't talk about your dreams until morning. And you don't go outside unless you absolutely have to, because the night is real. And it doesn't care about your prayers. It doesn't care how many tithes you've paid, how many saints you've memorized, how many times you've said sorry. The dark is bigger than that. But somehow you sleep anyway. You do it because you have to, because the animals need tending, because the fire needs wood, because the stew needs stirring, because the baby needs holding, because the world will come back in the morning, and it will not care how scared you were the night before. So you sleep. You pull the blanket tight, breathe in the smell of smoke and wool and old bread, and close your eyes. You listen to the breathing around you, the living proof that you've made it another day. And when the rooster crows, when the fire is stirred, when the door creaks open, and the cold pours in, you rise, because the light is back, and you've survived the night. Some years you're hungry, other years you're in a famine. They are not the same. Hunger, you understand. Hunger is predictable. It visits every household at some point. It whispers into your stomach, gnaws at your ribs, makes you stretch stew with more water bread, with more bark. But famine doesn't whisper. It roars, it takes, and it doesn't give anything back. You usually see it coming. That's the worst part. It starts slow, quiet, spring rains that don't stop, a frost that lingers too long, barley that comes up weak and thin, beans that bloom then wither, cabbages that split open before they ripen. You notice. Everyone does. No one says it, not out loud, but you look at each other differently. Then the questions start. Do we have enough from last year? Can we keep some seed for planting? How long will the root cellar hold? And the answers always are bad. By midsummer, you're already rationing, quietly, casually, a little less bread, a little more stew. The pot boils longer, thinner. You don't talk about it in front of the children. You tell them they're full even when they're not. You tell yourself the same thing. You hope that maybe another village had better luck, that the Lord's stores are full, that the steward might offer a sack of grain if you show up at the right time and say the right words, that someone, anyone, has a plan. By August, there's no pretending. The chickens are quieter, the goat's milk is thin, the dog watches you like it understands what might happen next, and the stew is mostly water. You start boiling herbs you don't normally touch. You chew bark, hoping it'll fill the space in your belly. You mash acorns, soak roots, bake bread that cracks your teeth and tastes like nothing. The pot never leaves the fire, but it's never full. The children stop asking for seconds. Then they stop asking at all. That's when you know. The village grows quiet. You don't hear songs. You don't hear fights. You hear footsteps slowly dragging from hut to hut. You hear coughing. You hear the wind. You hear your own stomach louder than anything else. You start skipping meals, not all at once, just quietly. You let the children eat first, then the old ones, then your spouse. You say you're not hungry. You lie. Eventually, you stop calling it lying. You're just trying to survive. Famine doesn't turn people evil. It turns them silent. You start to see less of your neighbors, not because they've left, but because they can't stand upright anymore. They sleep longer. They move slower. Some stop moving entirely. You find a dead bird. You don't bury it. You boil it. You don't cry. You don't gag. You thank God. Then you eat, and you tell no one. There's shame in famine. That's one of the strange parts, as if it's your fault, as if you didn't plan well, as if you're weak, as if your hunger makes you less worthy than the people who died before you. Your dreams get strange. You dream of feasts, tables full of bread and butter and thick gravy. You dream of fruit, fresh, glowing sweet. You dream of waking up full. You wake chewing your tongue, tears already on your face. You dream of your mother's kitchen, even though you've never had one. Then the deaths begin. You don't mark them like before. There's no ceremony, no bell. The priest might not even be alive anymore. The graves are shallow. The prayers are short. There's no one to sing, no one to dig deeper. You want to grieve, but grief takes energy. And you don't have that to spare. You keep moving, slowly, carefully, like every step is being measured by the ground. The steward stops coming, which is a relief and a problem. If he's not collecting, he's not helping. And the silence from the manor house starts to feel less like distance and more like abandonment. You tell yourself he's sick too. You hope he is. You hope they all are. And then one day something changes. A green shoot pushes up where nothing should have grown. Rain falls at the right time. The soil softens in your hand. You plant what little you saved, what little you didn't have the heart to eat. You watch every leaf like it's a promise. When the first harvest comes, small, barely enough to notice, you give it to the children, to the elderly. You take the scraps. You tell yourself it's fine. It is. It has to be. Then comes a loaf, a real loaf, brown, cracked, dense, heavy. You hold it in your hands longer than you should. You look at it. You smell it. You remember every hour your stomach felt like it might tear you open. And then you eat, slowly, carefully. Not because you want to savor it, but because you're afraid your body will forget how. You don't celebrate. Not really. You just sit beside the fire and watch the light dance on the wall and let the feeling of enough settle somewhere deep in your chest like a memory you thought you'd lost. Famine never really leaves you. Even years later, when the fields are full, when the pot boils with real meat, when the bread cracks just right, you still flinch when the sky clouds too long. You still count every loaf. You still dream about scraping crumbs off the floor. You survive, but survival has a shape, a shadow, and it follows you, even when you've made it out, especially then. By the time you could walk, the church already had your name. It wasn't something you chose. It was something poured over your head in cold water while Latin words filled the air. Baptism, the first sacrament, the first thread in the web of the church's presence. A presence that never left you. It didn't just hover around you on holy days. It was your calendar, your compass, your explanation for why things were the way they were, why the rain stopped, why the child didn't wake up, why your stomach was empty but your soul was supposed to feel full. The church wasn't a place. It was the system wrapped around the system. The Lord owned the land, but the church owned your afterlife. And if you weren't careful, that afterlife could cost more than your rent. There was a priest in your village, or close enough, a man in robes who walked with a mix of weariness and weight. He was often the only person who could read, which made him not just the gatekeeper to God, but also the village's library, counselor, judge, calendar, and sometimes doctor. He spoke with authority, not because he was always wise, but because he had the church behind him. He'd studied, trained, maybe even visited a city once. Maybe. That alone gave him power. When you were born, he was there. When you married, he stood before you. And when you died, it was his voice you hoped to hear one last time. Mass was in Latin. Always Latin. You didn't understand a word. You stood, You knelt. You mouthed along when others did. You learned the rhythm of it, even if the meaning stayed hidden. The priest lifted the bread. He lifted the wine. Something invisible happened. You didn't know what, but you believed, or you tried to. Belief wasn't about feeling something. It was about doing something. You showed up. You crossed yourself. You fasted when told. You lit candles when you could afford them. You handed over what little you had, because if you didn't, you weren't just failing the church. You were failing God. Your year wasn't divided by months. It was shaped by feasts and fasts. Lent, Advent, All Saints. You didn't say April. You said after Easter. You didn't say October. You said near St. Michael's. On fast days, you didn't eat meat. On feast days, you tried to. On saint days, you lit a candle if you could. On other days, you just hoped the priest didn't notice how tired your prayers had become. The church took 1/10 of everything. 1/10 of your grain, your wool, your cider, your eggs. Not a suggestion, a rule. Even if your harvest was bad, even if the chickens didn't lay, even if you had to go without stew for a week, just to scrape it together, you gave it. Because God's portion wasn't negotiable. Or at least, that's what they told you. The tithe barn was usually bigger than your house, which made sense. It had to hold the best of what everyone gave. While you swept crumbs into a corner, the tithe barn stored sacks of barley wheels of cheese, skins of cider. The irony didn't escape you. But you didn't say anything. Not aloud. Sometimes they let you pay in candles or labor. Sometimes they didn't. And when they didn't, you fell into debt. Spiritual debt, which felt worse somehow than regular hunger. But the church didn't just take. It gave too. It gave you stories. Of saints who walked through fire. Of martyrs who bled for a better world. Of sinners who found forgiveness at the edge of death. You didn't know where these saints lived, or when, but you knew their names. You whispered them when the stew boiled too long, when the wind knocked too hard, when the goat wouldn't birth or the child wouldn't breathe. Saint Apollonia for teeth, Saint Isidore for plowing, Saint Sebastian for plague. The church explained things no one else could, like why your cow died, or why your baby didn't cry, or why your neighbor's daughter was born with a crooked foot. It wasn't just fate. It was a lesson, or a test, or a punishment, something to accept, to endure, to confess. The church told you that suffering had meaning, that obedience had value, that the meek would inherit the earth, though it never said when. When you were sick, the priest offered prayers. Maybe a relic, a splinter of bone, a scrap of robe, a thread from a saint's sleeve. You held it like treasure. You hoped it mattered. When you were close to death, you sent for him. He came with oil, whispered blessings over your skin, told you it wasn't too late. Not if your heart was right. Then came the burial. If you were lucky, a plot in consecrated ground, a bell to mark your name, a prayer to send your soul forward. But even death wasn't free. There were prayers to pay for, candles to buy, masses to request, because your soul might not go straight to heaven. It might linger, in purgatory, in the in-between. And if you wanted it out, if you wanted it clean, you needed help. Your family could pray you through, or buy you through, if they had enough. If they didn't, you waited, in the dark, in the stories. But still, you believed, or acted like you did, which in this world was mostly the same thing. Because if the church wasn't true, if the system wasn't holy, if the prayers didn't matter, then nothing made sense. And that was more terrifying than anything. So you knelt, you fasted, you gave, you hoped that the bells would ring when you died, that someone would light a candle with your name on their lips. that you wouldn't be forgotten, that you had done enough, that you mattered, and that somewhere someone was listening. You'd think after all the hunger, the sickness, the taxes, the labor, that peasants would have revolted more, that the pressure would have built until something cracked. That one morning, someone would stand up pitchfork in hand and say, "No more," and sometimes they did. The Peasants' Revolt in 1381, the Jacquerie in France. Uprisings scattered across Europe like brush fires. They started with a spark too much tax, too many demands, a steward who took one sack of grain too many, and then they flared into something hot and brief. A tax collector run out of town, a manor burned, a banner raised, a crowd shouting that they would kneel no longer. But those flames never lasted. The answer was always the same: soldiers, punishment, silence. The leaders were hanged. The rest returned to their fields, and the weight of the world settled back into place like it never moved. So why didn't they revolt more often? Because they couldn't afford to. Rebellion takes time, energy, hope. Peasants had none of those in surplus. You could plan a revolution, or you could feed your children. You could march to the manor, or you could bring in the barley before the rain. You couldn't do both. They weren't naive. They weren't cowards. They were survivors. And survival is its own kind of rebellion. They didn't rise up because they understood the cost. Not in stories, in bodies, in the way a village mourns when a man disappears for saying too much, in the way a mother holds her child tighter when she hears the word gallows. There were no lawyers, no appeals, no rights to speak of, just the knowledge that the system wasn't built for you, and that stepping outside it didn't change the rules. It just left you outside them, alone. And even when you hated it, even when your back ached from work that wasn't yours, when the priest took your last egg, when the steward looked through you, you stayed. Because rebellion wasn't always a banner. Sometimes it was a loaf hidden from the tally, a piglet raised in secret, a patch of land tilled just beyond the official boundary. Sometimes it was a laugh shared at the Lord's expense, a rude song sung after too much ale, a quiet prayer that the roof would fall on the reeve's head just once. You resisted in the ways you could. You endured in the ways that mattered. You weren't alone. You had your family, your neighbors. The shared looks across the fire when someone mentioned the steward's new boots. The small favors traded without words. The understanding that no one else was coming to save you, and that meant you had to save each other. The village wasn't perfect. There were arguments, rivalries, gossip that cut deeper than it should, but it was yours. And destroying it to fight the system felt like breaking your own bones. You didn't revolt because the village wasn't just where you lived, it was how you lived. And still, sometimes things changed. A new lord who was kinder. A priest who actually listened. A storm that flattened the manor's grain and made the taxes go quiet for a season. Small shifts, never enough, but enough to keep going. You dreamed, though. Of course you dreamed. Not of kingdoms or crowns, but of days when your back wouldn't hurt before breakfast, when you didn't have to watch the steward count your barley, when you could eat meat on a Tuesday just because. You didn't expect those dreams to come true. You just needed them to exist, to get through another day of mud and aching hands and stew that tasted like boiled root and hope. The church played its part too, maybe more than the sword ever could. It told you your suffering was holy, that your obedience was rewarded, that heaven was for people like you, as long as you stayed quiet and hungry and grateful. It told you that meekness was strength, that patience was righteousness, that your labor wasn't lost, it was seen. You wanted to believe that. You had to. Because if suffering meant nothing, then why suffer at all? But belief was complicated. You bowed your head at Mass. You crossed yourself at the bell. But you also rolled your eyes when the priest stumbled. You smirked when someone slipped a bribe of eggs instead of coin. You told your children not to trust too easily, not even in holy robes. There were layers to your faith. There was reverence, there was resentment, and there was endurance. Because through all of it, you kept going. You taught your daughter how to stir the stew just right. You taught your son how to patch a boot without wasting thread. You passed down stories of saints and seasons and winters so cold the bread cracked in your hands. You taught them how to kneel when they had to, and how to rise when they could. And that was your rebellion. You didn't need to overthrow the manor to prove your strength. You didn't need to stand in the square and shout. You just needed to outlast them. And you did, time and again. The lords changed. The priests changed. The kings died, and new ones were crowned, and none of them ever visited your village. But your house still stood. Your pot still boiled. Your stories still lived. You were never the hero in the songs, but you were the reason the songs existed at all. You kept the world turning not with swords, but with soil-covered hands. And when the Lord's great hall finally crumbled, when the church's golden roof cracked, when history moved on to new names and new wars, your people remained. Because survival in the end was the most radical thing you could do. No one wrote songs about you. No bard stood at the fire and told tales of your bravery. No chronicler etched your name into parchment. No monument was carved for the generations of your family who lived, toiled, and died within 5 miles of where they were born. And yet without you, there was no story. Without you, there was no harvest, no manor, no kingdom. You didn't build cathedrals, but you carried the stone. You didn't sign charters, but you paid the tithes that funded them. You didn't wear crowns, but you bent your back so others could pretend their rule meant something. The world remembers kings, but it was peasants who kept it fed, who held it steady while the storms passed, while the lords waged wars, while the priests argued theology. You didn't have the time or luxury to worry about those things. You were too busy surviving, and that's what made you stronger than anyone realized. Because when the banners fell, and the soldiers scattered, and the grand halls crumbled into ivy-choked ruins, it was you and your kind who still rose. With the sun still dug in the dirt, still stirred the stew, still whispered bedtime stories to tired children beside tired fires. You didn't call it resistance. You didn't call it sacrifice. You just called it life. You handed down the tools that were never new. You taught songs that were never written. You passed on herbs, not by name, but by smell and shape and memory. You raised children who knew how to make do, how to care, how to keep the roof patched until spring. You taught them how to endure, how to be patient when the food ran low, how to be kind when the night crept close, how to grieve without falling apart, how to love quietly like a fire that never quite goes out. And the stories you told, they weren't about knights or saints or kings. They were about your grandfather's pig that always escaped, about the year the well froze and someone found water by following a crow, about the time your neighbor's cow gave birth in the middle of Mass and no one said a word because they all understood what mattered more. These were the stories that lasted because they weren't built on glory. They were built on truth, on shared hardship, on survival. The peasants of the medieval world didn't leave behind libraries or legacy wealth. They didn't build empires. They didn't chart oceans or write treaties. What they left was something quieter, something stronger, continuity, a thread that stretched from one generation to the next, even when everything else collapsed. It was in the way the same patch of soil was tilled again and again, in the way the same lullaby was sung in homes 100 miles apart, in the way that even now we still eat bread and stew and sit beside fires and tell stories when the night gets long. You didn't change the world all at once, but you held it together. And sometimes that's the greater feat. There's something holy in that kind of labor, in the way you learn to live inside of limits, in the way you made warmth from rot and comfort from clutter and hope from habit. You found meaning in small things, in surviving the cold, in finding enough wood for the fire, in keeping the stew from burning, in teaching your child to say a prayer even when you weren't sure if anyone was listening. You didn't ask for power. You asked for peace, for enough food, enough light, enough love to get you through another winter. And when you died, and you did quietly like most, you left behind more than a grave. You left behind a way of living, a rhythm, a resilience, a refusal to give up even when nothing gave back. History may forget your name, but the fields remember your hands. The earth remembers your steps. The stories, however quiet, however worn, still echo in the walls of every cottage that stood a little longer than it should have. You were not a king. You were not a knight. You were not a saint. You were a peasant, and you endured. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.